Sound speeds. And if you work in the film industry, you're at least somewhat aware of the very interesting way that we keep track of our time for purposes of getting paid. Now, I know what you're thinking. This is a very weird topic for a sound channel to be going over, right? Well, yes and no. This is a sound utility task, therefore it still falls under the category of sound, but if you work in any other department in the film industry, you should definitely pay attention to this video because this will also correspond to things that will affect your department as well, especially if you are the person that's in charge of keeping the time cards for the department. The other reason we're covering this is because I don't want my time card to be messed up when I get paid. I want it to be accurate and get all the money that is due to me. Therefore, we're going to be covering it in this episode. First things first, in America, if you're working a feature film or a scripted television show, chances are you're not working an 8-hour day like you do in the rest of the world. You are working a minimum of a 12-hour day, but you're paid by the hour. If you are working in ENG, reality, or commercial world, then chances are you're getting paid for a daily rate up to 10 hours. And so there is a difference in the way that time cards are managed. Here's a little piece of information you may find helpful when calculating your hours for the film industry. We do not work a 24-hour day, we work a 48-hour day. Let that sink in for a second and let me explain. If we start our day on Monday with a 7 a.m. call and we wrap it, let's say 9 p.m., day 2, Tuesday, we may be coming in at 9 a.m. and wrapping it, let's say 10 p.m. By the time we progressively push back the schedule based on our workload throughout the week, we may be coming in at 1 p.m. on Friday and wrapping at 2 a.m. on Saturday morning. So it would not make sense for us to put an out time of 2 a.m. because it's not the same day. Therefore, we don't count hours in a 24-hour basis, we count them in a 48-hour basis to make it easy for payroll to calculate our hours. The standard for the film industry is to not put an exact time on your time card. Instead, you would put down a whole number with a decimal point rounded to the nearest tenth. For example, if you started at 7 a.m., you would not put down 7:00 as your start time, you would put down 7.0. And keep in mind that every 6 minutes that increment corresponds to 0.1 of 1. So if you put down 7.1 on your time card, that would correspond to a start time of 7:06 a.m. 7:12 a.m. would be 7.2, and so on. As a matter of fact, I'm going to throw this up there, right there for you to visualize as I'm talking. I haven't said it yet, but this is as good a time as any to explain one term that you're going to probably hear me say here, which is click. One click is a 6-minute increment, which is basically corresponding to 1/10 of an hour on your time card. So if I say 2 clicks, that means 12 minutes. If I say 3 clicks, that means 18 minutes, and so forth. Side note, I'm not going to be covering things like grace and extensions because those things are going to differ based on a few factors, like are you working in a city like LA, or are you working in a different production city or a production center, or the contract you're working under. There's various different things that are going to affect the way that you calculate such things. So I'm not going to be going into those. That's pretty much everything you need to know about your start time unless you have a pre-call or you have a leave time. Let me explain. In the film industry, you typically get a catered breakfast, you work 6 hours, then you get a catered lunch. And if you work longer than 6 hours, you are going to start accruing what's called meal penalties, which is an amount of money that you're paid from production for them not feeding you on a timely manner. And that's based on the contract you're under. It could be every 30 minutes, it could be every 45 minutes. You got to look at the contract and it will tell you. But here's how that plays in with pre-calls. If the general crew call is, let's say, 7 a.m. and you're brought in an hour early for a 6 a.m. pre-call, your morning would be 7 hours. If you worked your typical 6-hour morning and then expected to be fed, you're going to be out of sync with the rest of the crew. That's going to totally throw off their day because if sound suddenly broke away, then you have no sound department and the rest of the company is down. So what they require you to do is take what's called a non-deductible breakfast, or NDB. So if you have a 7-hour morning, they want you to get in sync with the rest of the crew. So they're expecting at some point for you to take about 15 minutes out of your morning in order to get yourself fed from catering without putting it on your time card anywhere. A leave time is basically a pre-call given to your distant hires working on your show, and it's based on how far away production believes the hotel is to your set. So if, for example, production thinks that it takes them 12 minutes to drive from the hotel to your set, they're going to give you a 12-minute leave time. So if the general crew call is 7 a.m., they're expected to leave at 6:48 a.m., therefore that would be their leave time. Nearby hires are not given a leave time because you're expected to show up for work like you would any other job without receiving compensation for driving to and from work. provided that you're working within a reasonable distance or a zone from your production center or production city. If, for example, your location is 12 miles past the edge of the zone, production is going to be paying you to drive those 12 miles, and they're going to be paying you to drive back those 12 miles at the end of your day. And they're going to be paying you on the clock for driving them. And it's going to be based on the reasonable amount of time as seen by production for driving them, usually in an off-peak time. So if it's mostly interstate, there's probably going to be a 12-minute time frame they expect you to drive that amount of time in. If it is interstate and back roads, chances are it could be 18 or 24-minute drive time in order to get you there. So your day will start early, either indicated on your start time or someplace on the call sheet. And if it's not there, ask. Now you got your start time down to a science, and that's typically one of 4 categories the sound utility has to keep track of in order to make sure you're paid properly. Those are the start time, the wrap time, and the out time and end time. And those out and end times are pertaining to lunch. The time you leave for lunch is the out time. The time you're back from lunch is your end time. How is lunchtime calculated? Well, if you're given a 30-minute lunch and you're broken on time at, let's say, 1 p.m., that's when the crew is going to start making their way through the lunch line. And if it takes 20 minutes for the last union person to get through that lunch line and sit down with their food, then they officially call him or her the last man. And that's when lunch officially starts, because it's not fair to them to only have 10 minutes of time to eat their food. So they're going to be given 30 minutes to eat their food from that last man time. So lunch would officially be over at 1:50. So it pays you to rush to get to the lunch line early, because you're going to get extra time to maybe take a nap with. But on your time cards, you're going to put that down as 13.0 because you were broken on time at 1 p.m. and your back end time is 13.5. So technically you're still at lunch when you're officially starting your afternoon. If you were given an hour for lunch, that's typically considered a hard hour, meaning that it would start from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Doesn't matter if it takes you 20 minutes to get through the lunch line or you're the first person in line, you still have an entire hour to get through that lunch line and eat. So it is your hour to do with as you please. On your time card, it would be 13.0 to 14.0. Sometimes production calls a hard hour lunch for a shady reason, like catering is too far away. So let's say that right at 1 o'clock, you jump in a van, you ride 15 minutes to your catering, you go through the line in 20 minutes, you eat, and then you get on your 15-minute ride back to your set. Then you'll make it on time. But if it's raining and you have to cover up gear and you miss all the vans that first left right at 1 o'clock, then you have to wait for those vans to go to catering and back from catering in order to pick you up to take you to catering. Now it's 45 minutes into your hard hour lunch, and by the time you factor in your 15 minutes back, you have no time to eat. That's why it's shady. Under that circumstance, your union steward should definitely make a call to their business agent, because production cannot take advantage of the crew like that. You need to be given 30 minutes to eat, and if they make it impossible because of the drive time for you to properly get your 30 minutes, then that's not your fault. That's poor production planning. Now let's talk about your wrap time. If production calls wrap 6 hours after your lunchtime ended, then technically you are due for another feeding. However, production has a grace window on many productions of 30 minutes to allow the crew to wrap up and get out of there without them having to pay a meal penalty. If it takes you more than 30 minutes to wrap, then they'll not only pay you for the second meal penalty, they're going to also start paying you for the first meal penalty. That's not to say you need to start milking the clock to get to 0.6 in order to start getting paid for that. Not at all. That just means that production has a little bit of window in there. Typically, you're going to want to try to get out of there as quick as possible. But if it takes you an extra amount of time to wrap, that's when you're going to start to see those meal penalties. 99.999% of the time, production does not want to provide a second catered meal 6 hours after lunch ended, even if we're going an extra long day. And that's fine by the crew. We would rather just accrue meal penalties and power through the day to finish the thing, knowing that Crafty is most likely going to have our food needs taken care of. That could mean pizza, that could mean subs, that could mean burgers or salads or something, but we can count on Crafty to feed us, to help us get enough fuel to make it on our way home. Some people do what's called padding your hours, which is putting a wrap time on your timesheet sometime after the time that you believe you're officially going to be done working. For example, let's say that you are officially thinking that you're going to be done at 7:48 p.m. Instead of putting 19.8 as your wrap time, if you put 20.0, you're padding your hours. Now, the reason why people do this is, let's say you are on location and crew is sometimes waiting for a van to take you home at the end of the day. And depending on where the vans are, they may be taking a director or cast members back to a hotel, and the vans may be scarce at the end of the day. And if that's the case, it could mean that you're waiting 15 or 20 minutes at the end of the day to make it back to your car. So people will sometimes build a pad in there to compensate themselves for a wait on a van. Another common practice you sometimes see in the sound department is when the sound mixer bails as soon as they call wrap. Sometimes the boom operator does too, leaving the sound utility to have to collect all the comm techs and cables and put all the gear and stuff away all by themselves. Now, this wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing provided their out times reflected the time that they work, but many sound mixers will say put us all out at the same time. So they're actually being paid, and the boom operators are being paid for time they're not working, and because it takes the sound utility longer to do it all by themselves, they're getting extra money that the whole department really shouldn't be seeing, because if everybody did it together, it would maybe only take like 15 or 20 minutes. Sometimes the sound mixer likes the sound utility to also keep track of the amount of meal penalties that are accrued leading into lunch and at the end of the day. And that would be written as a fraction, the number of meal penalties in the morning over the number of meal penalties in the afternoon. Now let's look at a more advanced example just to make sure you fully understand. Let's say that call time is at 2:00 p.m., lunch is on time and half an hour long, and you wrap at 6 a.m. Go. Okay. Your start time is going to be at 14.0. Your lunch is going to be at 20.0, and you're back in from lunch at 20.5 with a wrap at 30.0. That's because, if you remember, you're working a 48-hour day, not a 24-hour day. As crazy as this may sound, there is a method to the madness. It makes it easier for payroll to pay you correctly. Let's look at how. They start with your out time of 30.0, and they subtract from that your start time of 14.0, and that gives them a total elapsed time of 16.0 hours. They subtract from that your 0.5 for your half-hour lunch, and that gives 15.5 total hours worked. How many meal penalties in the morning? There were none. It was on time, so that's 6 hours deducted from that 15.5, leaving 9.5 hours in the afternoon that was worked. How many meal penalties are they going to pay? Well, that's completely dependent on the contract you're under, so that gives you an idea of how it's done. One more thing I do want to mention, and that is if you're working in reality TV, ENG, commercial world, something like that, and you're getting paid a certain amount of money for a certain number of hours worked. If that is, let's say, $550 for a 10-hour day, you would think that to calculate your hourly wage, you would simply take $550 and divide it by 10, but that's not the way it works. You actually divide it by 11. The reason why is because the first 8 hours you work is at regular time, and the next 2 hours you work is at time and a half. And those 2 time and a half hours basically correspond to 3 hours of regular pay. So you would divide it by 11, and so you get $50 an hour. That is also a reason why you should not give production a guarantee for 12 hours. It really cuts in on your hourly wage. Here's why. The first 8 hours would be at regular time, and the next 4 hours would be at time and a half. That multiplied together would be 6 hours plus the 8 hours, 14. So now you take the $550, divide by 14, and you get $39.26. Your hourly wage has gone down from $50 down to $39.26 because you added 2 more hours to your guarantee. That means production is going to look to pay you less next time because they're going to have your hourly wage on the books as $39.26. So there's a quick crash course on the way that the film industry manages the time clock. The sound utility will keep track of the hours for the entire department throughout the week. And every single day, they're going to turn in the hours worked for that day on a daily time sheet. And at the end of the week, they're going to fill out a weekly time card for each member of the sound department. And that should reflect the number of hours you worked for the entire week. So now you should fully understand how to fill out your daily time sheet and your weekly time cards to keep that sound mixer and boom operator off your back. That's a whole bunch of sound advice. Have a question you'd like answered or want to add something? Be sure to write it in the comment section down below. You can also make a suggestion for future topics of discussion. Again, comment section down below, or you can email me at soundspeeds@yahoo.com. Be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on future sound advice.